Media Roundtable, special edition. If you've been keeping up with us, we've spent the last few years talking to leading voices in podcast about what they create, why they create it, and the impact they want it to have on the world. This is a special episode as one of our key industry conferences, Podcast Movement, took place last week, and Dan, Spencer, Stephen, and other members from our team attended the event. They're here today to speak about some of the insights and highlights from the conference, as well as to share a little bit about what they mean for the podcast industry moving ahead. I'm your host, Jennifer Lane, Head of Brand Purpose at Oxford Road, and today I'm joined by Dan Granger, Founder and CEO of Oxford Road, Stephen Abraham, President of Oxford Road, and Spencer Simonson, Media Buyer at Oxford Road. Dan, Stephen, Spencer, welcome to the Media Roundtable.
Hi.
Thrilled to have you guys here. You're obviously thrilled to be here also. I think the best place to start is sort of just general perspectives on the conference, on the industry direction, et cetera. Dan, do you want to dive in and just share some thoughts that you had after attending Podcast Movement this past week?
I do, and I have to ask for everybody's forgiveness up front that it's a bit of maybe a little bit of chest beating for the agency. I know that's not really what we're here to do. We're going to break down serious issues, but I will say, this is our 10th year in business, and maybe I'm just getting nostalgic, but it was really incredible to walk around and see not only our team represented there and the impact that we're able to make on the industry, but all of the people that have come out of Oxford Road. I had multiple people basically say that Oxford Road is like the Y Combinator of the podcast industry, or like the William Morris mailroom. There are so many stars in this industry that learned the industry from our firm in the last 10 years. It's incredible. And I was just really proud. Miranda, our head of media, was on a panel on Thursday, and 3 of the 5 people on the panel were from Oxford Road at one point. And the moderator of the panel is somebody that we're very close in partnership with. So just to kind of feel the connection throughout the ecosystem was, I think, a moment of pride for me, and I think for everybody at this company. And it's really incredible to see what happens when you have 10 years of relationships, and even looking at some of them and going, wow, I kind of wish we had, I wish I had played my part differently with one individual or another over the course of time. If you stay in it with people, it's amazing just the goodwill that can happen in an environment like this, in a universe where everybody kind of has this shared goal and purpose to advance this industry. It was really cool. And so it was like people from Amazon, people from Artsai, Wondery, Hulu, Sirius, people on the brand side. It's really, really incredible to see what we've been able to achieve. And that was just, that was touching for me. And I think there's also, I think the industry's at a bit of an inflection point. And with a lot of the turbulence that you're seeing in the economy and how that's impacting some of the investments that have happened, you're seeing a lot of changing of the guard in terms of people that might have been cornerstones of the industry 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago. A lot of those folks have stepped down, and there's new blood. I would say that we're now, I'm feeling like the old guy in the group. When it comes to the agencies, just kind of being the last founder that is still, engaged in on the agency side, and we're seeing that across the ecosystem with a lot of people as kind of the second generation coming in. So that was kind of my perception from where I sit, just watching things evolve in this little strange Wild West boutique industry that's on its way to growing up. And you're seeing some people come in and you're seeing some people go out. And it's a milestone, I think, for the industry as well as for our firm. So that was what struck me.
Well, and I think I know you're very slow to give any compliments to Oxford Road, so I know that doesn't come lightly. But no, I think to your point, you never know where people are going to land, and you do a great job of training everyone. And it's nice to finally be back in person and have conferences live and see people face to face and figure out what's going on. And I think it's always great to look back and really take account of how the agency has grown and how the industry has grown. And I mean, to that end, I guess passing it to Stephen, like, what's next for the industry? Where is innovation coming from? Do we have an answer to that? Does anyone have an answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, Dan took some of the words out of my mouth. I just for anybody who's listening and watching this, I'm new to the industry. Been in podcasts probably for 2 years. Joined from much bigger agencies. And, at the time when Dan and I first started talking, when I came over, I was very much around sort of, well, look, it's in its infancy. It's going to be interesting what happens over the next few years to see where the platform changes. I think Dan coined it quite well at the beginning and the top of this. The industry is at an inflection point. But for me, as a first time podcast movement virgin, shall we say, going there for the very first time and being exposed to the industry in general, I was astonished. I was astonished at how mature it actually was, the degree of complexity, the degree of conversations that were being had across the board, and the degree of sophistication with which it was being addressed. Some of the panels could be quite easily put on any of the upfronts or the new fronts. It was that mature, which led me to my next point. And this is why I actually put this subject matter on when you and I are discussing the various different subjects, Jennifer, is I come from a background where I've always been working in very mature sort of media environments and always looking to see where the puck's going, where's the innovation going to be coming from. And I was fascinated to see that there's still a lot of it seems to be being talked about. Certainly, I kind of group innovation in two camps. One is augmentation of what's currently going on, and the other is in sort of, innovation that's actually going to be something fundamentally new. Now, podcast is genuinely maturing, which is a sign of positivity. We know that the dollars that have been swilling around for the last few years are possibly drying up a little bit, and some people have caught a cold with the number of networks they've bought. But it doesn't mean to say that podcast is not maturing. A lot of the technologies we witnessed at podcast movement were fascinating. I'm not even going to name some of them because they're in at the ground floor and we're going to be working with them. But I see a lot of innovation being moved in the area of how can we augment what is ultimately a two-dimensional medium, which is aural only. And some of the opportunities that are putting themselves out there that we could be associated with are fascinating. There are certainly ways where we can see the static means of an individual using their smart device, which is fundamentally in their pocket. And we all know about simulcasts on YouTube where you can watch at the same time. But there are innovations coming to the forefront, which are actually using sound cues within the audio itself to trigger visual stimulation and visual augmentation on the actual medium. There's a number of different ways that this can be used, whether that's with the content providers themselves. As you all know, on this podcast, I listen to a lot of sports, not just in podcast, but the amount of times I've heard hosts have to say, so I'm looking at a league table or I'm looking at some stats here, let me describe it to you. That can now be overcome with a sound cue actually triggering an image of a piece of content that is going to support and augment the conversation that's going on. Now, this can then be transferred very easily into a commerce discussion, whereby it can be a promotion code that's sent, or indeed, a discount voucher that can automatically then be downloaded to the user's phone. So that's one area of innovation that I see is real augmentation purely over sound. The other area, which I think is not to be underestimated and is going to be coming to the forefront with, chatbots and AI and GPT, etc., which is interactivity. Obviously, there are all sorts of ways that podcasts can be streamed, we know, through smart devices. Being able to choose your own adventure in the podcast, especially with news and topical, or what I call perishable media, whereby you can't just necessarily store it and listen to it over time, but it's got to be listened to in that moment of you being able to request to your device on feeding you the information that you want to know specifically. And that, again, is linked to AI and kind of artificial learning around the voice capabilities of all of these different mediums. But it certainly isn't dry, and I certainly saw a lot of those conversations bubble into the forefront. I'd open it to the floor, actually, to see anybody else has seen anything, because that consumed a lot of my time. Podcast movement. Yeah,
I know, Spencer, you had some conversations surrounding AI. What would you like to share here?
I mean, AI is coming up more and more in every industry. ChatGPT is being used widespread at our agency, and we're talking a lot about the ways that machine learning can change brand suitability, safety, programmatic targeting. One panel that I really loved was about AI and how it can affect minority communities. That's actually a really important topic to think about, especially if this is a widespread technology that's going to be used across the industry, because we have seen issues in different industries around that, whether it's policing, whether it's around voice recognition, because whoever trains the AI still has those biases and can feed that into the algorithm. We could have problems around, AAVE being flagged for brand suitability issues. We could have certain slang terms being flagged that are very true for a specific culture. And what's important to think about as we augment all of this technology and we move forward as an industry is that we look at the entire industry, not just the main voices within it or the voices that we most align with.
I know. So moving up the topic of brand safety a little bit, because those two go hand in hand, and there are a lot of organizations working really hard to try to understand sort of localized brand safety to host and community. Dan, what did you see in brand safety at Podcast Movement? Was this a topic that was pretty consistent this year as well as it has been other years, or was safety and suitability a lesser player?
Yeah, it was still definitely a topic. Came up unsolicited outside of the specific session that I had on that topic. I was on another panel and it came up. I had several people talk unprompted about contrasting the different solutions and where that's all going. I will say it was interesting. One, I missed having you there, Jennifer. I know the last 2 years, we've both shared the stage introducing some of the new advancements that we've been championing in this space.
I missed it also.
But it was, thank you. But it was kind of, it was fun to be able to go now that, the foundation that you helped us build. And I'll just say, there's nobody more knowledgeable or engaged in this topic in the industry than Jennifer. But it was cool to be able to now say, instead of just talking about a specific application of the solution, to be able to talk broadly about the problem and broadly about the solution. And, one of the things that I'll just give you a quick summary of some of the things that I shared in my really address of the industry on this was that we're in a very complex world right now. It's being called a poly crisis, just so many crises going on all at once. And people need clarity. They need sanity. They need a better understanding of what's going on in the world around them and kind of a move away from all this tribalism. They're bad, we're good, we hate the bad guys, let's defeat them. And so much of that has infected podcasts. And, we'll have all these dictates come from advertisers like no politics, but the challenge is that everything is political now. Like you pick a topic, it is political. And so it can be really, really hard for brands to know what to do. And so we talk about these concepts of brand safety and brand suitability. And when you strip it away, safety to me is very much just about brands needing an insurance policy so they don't get surprises that somebody said something adjacent to their message that is now causing a backlash on the business. Nobody likes those surprises. On the other hand, we have the concept of suitability, which is really about finding value alignment and moving toward that and seeking content that agrees with what you're trying to do. And my challenge to the industry is really that we have tools now that can evaluate how divisive you're being or what you're wading into and the level of responsibility that you're bringing to a conversation. And what we need to move away from on the advertising side is make it less about avoidance of topics, because topics are really important, even if they're tough. and more toward responsibility around those topics. And the industry is still in this middle place where we're still very topic sensitive. But I think where I see this going, and I think AI getting more sophisticated, we're going to be able to do more and more with sentiment and more to identify who is making ad hominem attacks and attacking people versus attacking problems and issues and arguments. And that's what we want to see. And so our call to action to the industry was really like, look, we're going into another terrible election cycle. It's going to be brutal. And if you want more money for your network, the best thing you can do is be a builder of bridges rather than somebody that burns them and exploits our differences. And that as an agency, we want to be a champion highlighting those opportunities for people that are doing good in the world. So that was a fun thing to discuss. We had a moment of controversy even in the session where somebody from a particular network that had a political bent said, they were a left-wing network that most people have heard of. And they said, what do we do? Because a study just came out and said 80% of the misinformation is coming from the right. So how do we not get blocked because of what they're doing wrong? And my response to that was basically that you're looking at the problem wrong. If you think that the other people that you disagree with, if they change, then everything will be okay. That's the fundamental issue we're trying to deal with. Until everybody looks in the mirror and says, what am I bringing to it? Is it 5%, 10%, 20% of the problem? How do I solve that? Then we can start making movement. But as long as we're stuck in this bind of saying, everything will be fine as long as they change, I don't have to change, we stay where we are. And everything is dicey. Everything is toxic. And brands will continue to operate out of fear in those environments. So it was a big topic. It's an important topic, and the tech is here and continuing to get better. But at the end of the day, I think people know and can assess if they're making topics or if they're programming around things that are constructive dialogue or if they're exploiting. And so I just challenge everybody to do a self-assessment of that and get on the right track, because there's money that will come to you for doing the right thing in the long term, even if it's not the low-hanging fruit today in some cases.
Well, and this speaks directly to something that our agency is laser focused on, and that's purpose and performance, and this perfect equilibrium and balance between the two of them. And I know others are focused on it as well. More recently, it's gained some momentum, but I guess what type of conversations were happening around that at the conference? And what type of budgets, I guess, how are people approaching budgets? What percentage is being dedicated to both, or is it even an either or conversation?
Well, what I'll say is, just because we've been working on this since before anybody was talking about it, it's gone from a, hey, what is that? And a curiosity a couple of years ago to, we might want to deal with that. And we know a year ago, Joe Rogan was the biggest story before the invasion of Ukraine. And that got everybody really paying attention. A year later, my assessment is that everybody has accepted that this is a necessary, solutions to this problem are now necessary. And it's like attribution where, people might have tried to find ways to avoid it. I think people are accepting that this is here and they need to have an answer to it. And I see a lot of players scrambling, whether they're a platform, trying to figure out how do I integrate the tech that's available, or whether they are trying to create some sort of a tech or find a third party or do an assessment of their own content. I'm finding that everybody is expecting to have to contend with this and trying desperately to figure out how to do so quickly.
I guess opening it up to the whole panel on this conversation, I know we, with some of our clients, have encouraged them to explore channels that we know are performing very well that may have been outside of what their perceived parameters were before. How are we having those conversations, and how are we using tech to really sort of deliver the data they need to be convinced?
When we put certain things in front of the client, we always give them every bit of information that they would want initially. So if I'm pivoting a client who's very specific to brand safety, I generally want to come to them and explain the possible repercussions of a certain choice, or the specific content via maybe barometer polls or other DR advertisers and their strategy, because generally the conversation begins with me saying, look, I know that you had previously said no to this option, but here is the data that I have. This advertiser who does care about brand suitability and safety and his direct result is on this show, this amount of frequency, this often, and they're seeing a lot of results. So while this, these issues might be, cause like issues on social media, long-term, you will see success. Generally too, I will be just very candid and honest with them. Generally around like the contents, like, oh, this kind of person might be offended, or this kind of person might not use the product afterwards, but here are the long-term growth. And I also will like put a disclaimer about like, this is here on the spectrum. We used to use multiple charts and like hard data to showcase how things were on a spectrum, whether that's like information or political bench. But now we just kind of look more at like each individual piece of the puzzle. And I think that is helping push us forward that much more versus just being like, this is bad, this is good.
I think I echo everything Spencer's just said. I mean, she's very much more in the coalface, actually having those conversations and looking at the tech to make sure that we can ensure clients that we're working with are going to appear in only brand safe environments. But I also don't think it's a cut and dry discussion that you can have at a beginning of a campaign. I think it's an ongoing discussion, right? This is a living and breathing world that we're in. The world today versus a couple of years ago is very different. We hear the word all the time. Lots of media environments are more extreme in what their views are, or being more passive. So I think it's something that we, as responsible consultants and stewards of our clients' dollars, have to be ever vigilant on in every single instance. It's not just a piece of tech, but understanding the depth that each individual host is going to go into, being informed early up front about the kind of conversations they could go, not wanting to control it, because obviously there's always going to be a church and state between editorial and commercial, but having as much information up front as we can to be able to guide. But I would also say that we as an agency, I think very often with our clients, also ask them to take it from a sense perspective. Just sometimes, because you're appearing, if there is a controversial individual, you can't always control that, but it can be managed to a degree that you can come out of it still supporting certain areas, but not necessarily being tainted by one-off comments that happen in a podcast, and being able to educate them and put it into perspective. I think there's always a conversation around that.
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. You know, I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, you know, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to your point of it being a living and breathing relationship and environment, that is critical every single time. And managing expectations. I mean, no one's perfect. No one is completely consistent all the time, but providing the data and having real-time response, which I think agencies such as Oxford Road are best in class and will help these things, will make this a more navigable path moving forward.
Yeah, but to sort of, I know we might want to move on in a moment, but to Dan's point of where we're in I can't remember the actual term you used. Was it poly something or other, Dan?
It was
crisis.
Poly crisis, where there's multiple crises. There always has been. It's just in a post-pandemic, or as we move out of a pandemic world. I mean, the very nature of the world we live in at the moment, and the way that people's sensibilities, and I haven't yet said the word woke. Oh no, I actually said it, but we're actually in that kind of world, means that we need to be very cautious. We need to be very careful. 3 or 4 years ago, these subjects were not spoken about in the same length they are now. Now it's the very first thing that people think about. So we as advisors need to be balanced and giving the right consultancy, because you can always have a knee jerk in all of these situations. And I think it's about how you approach it in a balanced way, which is the whole point of the debate that Dan was having at Podcast Movement. Yeah. Stimulate a discussion.
Well, and
I was in the room when the media vendor posed that.
I'm sure you were throwing roses and not tomatoes.
Thoroughly enjoyed the response, I can say.
All right. So going into some of the specifics about how podcast has shifted focused a little bit, there are 2 topics I want to dive into. One being sort of the future of interactive podcast. It takes a number of different channels, and number 2 being localization. But let's start with interactive. This was a trend that we have talked about on the podcast before. I think no one is entirely sure of what the future is yet, but there are many channels being tested. There are many strategies being tested. What did we hear about interactive at Podcast Movement this week?
Well, I mean, for want of what I was kind of talking about at the beginning, I don't want to rehash what I just talked about, but certainly the interactive opportunities were the forefront of many tech businesses and many platforms. I mean, subsequent to the conversations that I had with 1 or 2 of these tech brands, I then raised it. Actually, Dan was in a couple of the meetings with some of the larger platforms, and it probably generated the most interest. So they're as keen to start to understand where the puck's moving and how they can make the offering of the product of their various different the podcasts that they have in their portfolio to make them as more interactive as possible. I don't think everybody's solved it, but certainly the augmentation piece that I was talking about, with interstitials being fed in to augment just purely an audio consumption channel into something much more visual, is one area where I think there's going to be a huge amount of growth over the next 12 to 18 months.
It's interesting because we're still in this middling sophomore phase now with the industry, right? And so you see a lot of tech trying to solve a lot of problems and bring new opportunities into being, whether that's, adapting to a both and environment where we're all now using the term simulcast and everybody's kind of accepted YouTube. Everybody's waking up to, hey, we need a visual and an audio solution for those that do want to have their face pointed at a screen while it's running or periodically, right? So I think that's big. There's a lot around attribution. There's a lot around verification that I think people are waking up to. And one of the challenges that I think the industry has been in while it's all been wild, wild west is that there's too many unknown unknowns. Like, we don't even know how people are using it. We don't know how they're going to adapt to technology we use in other digital channels. And we don't even necessarily know what our problems are that are unique to our industry. What I see happening, the big shift to me, is we're now in the known unknowns, where we're at least aware of what a lot of our problems and challenges are. And you're starting to see previews of where we think it's going, where we want it to go. And what's really hard living in this moment in between knowing where it's going and knowing where it's been is that it can take a long time for some of this stuff to get integrated. Just think about, we're doing this podcast on a Zoom call. Well, video conferences are not new. We saw several waves of them, and they were not good enough to make an industry standard until it took something like COVID to hurry everybody up and adapt and to evolve into something that is now a standard part of how people do business. I think you're going to be seeing 5 to 10 years of people teasing things that are coming, or they'll be first to market and they'll try to bring it, but the first to market isn't always the one that's going to be successful. And so I think we know where it's going, but whether or not that's a 24 to 36 month thing, or whether or not we're talking more like 72 to 120 months, that's where I think the question mark still remains in my mind.
I would add to that and say, I think, Dan and I agree on a lot, and we sometimes converse on other things. On this, we're absolutely 100% aligned. I think it's also fair to say that, COVID affected many sectors, right? Not just Zoom. Podcast had a massive boost. But what I would also say is that early adopters don't usually care so much about getting the fundamentals right. They're early adopters because they just want to test and they want to experiment and they want to see, right? And maybe they're not so concerned about the devil in the detail. But as we said, podcast has now matured. You're getting the big brands come in who have certain folks that stakeholders and shareholders in the street to content, and they have to be more fiscally managed and much more focused on the details. So what happens is you see this arc as it begins to mature, as innovation comes in, and as the question around attribution and measurement comes in, they then say, okay, let's put a pause. Budgets have now got a certain point, because on most campaigns now, for regardless of brand, podcast is becoming a stalwart. It's no longer an experiment. It's actually a fixture on brand schedules now. So what's happening is you're now seeing people go back and say, actually, I've got a few more questions because I wasn't an early adopter. I've just jumped into it, and now I'm seeing the areas that need to be fixed. So the innovation is going to actually have to come into a lot of the fundamentals. And I know we're not going to cover it on this specific roundtable, and definitely going to be covering it on a future one. But the question around attribution and measurement partners and accountability is a huge question that was on everybody's lips at Podcast Movement. 45 minutes won't do it justice, and you probably don't have the best folks to answer it on this, and you'll have them on another one. But that is definitely an area where we need to see development, we need to see innovation, and we as an agency are going to hold a gold standard.
I will say there is one study from the last Cumulus study about different listenership, and that was simulcast, which was that most loyal podcast listeners, for the most part, only listen on video platforms or through simulcast, and that most people who were audio only before COVID have switched. And that is because a lot of people started working from home. They don't have commutes. And even with many trends in the consumer space going towards back to the office, like lack of athleisure wear, more business attire, we still have video and simulcast as the top platform for most listeners, whether that's Spotify with video integration or YouTube.
Interesting. We'll link that in our show notes, actually, for anyone who's keen to dive deeper into that. Surely a topic that we have spoke about a bit and will continue to speak about. Another topic per earlier is localization, especially when it comes to sports and news. Spencer, what did you hear at Podcast Movement that was speaking to this specifically?
I think local podcasts in general, especially around sports and news, have been very common. I think that makes sense, especially if you're dovetailing off of radio and growing substantially from there. And mostly what I've seen in the past was run of networks or bundles of smaller shows put together because there wasn't the scale, and most advertisers wanted to be in the highest reach options. But as we try more and more to target very specific demographics, whether that's through programmatic, streaming, geo-targeting, we're trying to get more and more back to the local radio model, where we're trying to reach those people who will tune in very quickly to the content. So not only are you getting that very quick awareness, but you're also getting the timeliness. So if you have a specific CTA or a specific product that's only true for a certain amount of time, that is probably your best strategy long term. And we're talking about it more and more with our larger clients and with our older demo clients. So it will keep coming up. The conversations that I generally have are around news, especially as we near the election cycle.
And Stephen, I know you're in the trenches with some of our clients on this. What do you have to add here about how we're walking hand in hand with them to test this out?
Well, look, I mean, testing, they always ask the question, can we do localized tests? And the answer is, as Spencer said, yes, you can. And I think it's around understanding which are the genres that best give you the opportunity where you're going to get tests and get the best results. I mean, we talk about news, but as I mentioned before earlier, I have this big I'm on this big trip around perishable media and how podcast can be used in different ways, right? We've all seen the famous success of downloading crime-related podcasts, serials of this world that made the platform famous. But what happens is people tend to download them and then listen to their own leisure, which is a beauty of podcast. It's a massive advantage. But that's going to be really limiting for certain clients that want to get in or have very timely sort of business cycles that you have to be involved in on a short space of time. And where sports can really help is, the news around sports. I mean, I'm a sports consumer. The news around sports has to be consumed in an immediate place, right? So you can really sort of localize with regards to fan bases. And the more we can look into that and test that in the US, the more unified we're going to have in terms of creating what I think are going to be more efficient plans. So you can buy a plan on a large podcast and get a large amount of reach. But if you then buy a suite of, say, 7, 8, 9, 10 individual small podcasts that speak very specifically to smaller but really engaged fan bases that are linked to a specific team, you may still get the same level of 1+ reach, but you're getting a much more individual engaged audience base, right? So the localization opportunities there within sports, topics, entertainment, and news are paramount in my mind. So that's going to lead into other discussions around how effective programmatic can be, because, that's obviously going to be very different. The fact of planning in podcasts still needs to be very hands-on and understanding those idiosyncrasies around each of the audience elements. And as we move through from buying just traditionally in terms of rate buying to audience buying as the platform matures, this is going to become ever more prevalent in consumers and marketeers' minds to reach consumers.
Yeah, especially when it comes to parameters around legality of certain products in different markets. I think this could be a very critical issue.
Distribution as well. I mean, so, we're talking to clients that are predominantly distributed on talking about domestically, and we can get into international at another point, that have limited we're talking about a massive continent in the US, right? Some brands only have distribution in certain areas. They want to get into podcasts. They can see the value. So how can podcast help them that? And that's where we're going to get to a point. Can we start geo-targeting the ads, still buy a national, but only be able to reach certain users in certain areas to be able to service those clients that only have distribution there? So it's another area we need to explore.
And that'll break open wide net of opportunity for brands who have had to stay at bay. Transitioning from micro to macro localization to international, I know this might be a little bit of a premature conversation as we're heading to podcast show in London that will speak to this topic more specifically and expansively. But Stephen, what are you seeing already in this space as podcast has been international for a while, but brands that are based in the US are looking to sort of expand their footprint in a larger way globally?
I mean, it's a conversation that we are taking very seriously, because driven not only by the fact that I think there's a huge amount of white space, and I hate using that term, but there really is. There's a lot more white space as podcasters matured, specifically in the US. We're now seeing that same trajectory in international. So there's a lot of opportunity there for those brands that get in early. We're seeing a lot of our brands, the companies and partners that we work with and that we counsel and steward, asking more and more questions around, well, how can I get into English speaking markets, but more importantly into foreign language markets as well. One of the beauties about podcasts is you can actually buy a lot of those podcasts directly from the US. So the logistics of actually getting in are not complicated. Where it becomes more complex is obviously the majority of podcasts out there are English speaking. We're seeing growth of local language podcasts as audiences begin to adopt the platform. Where we're going to see, I think, a huge growth is in the area of transcreation. So actually being able to take the kind of creation that we have in the US, mirror it in other markets, but obviously in local tongue and local language. But that's still never enough. The local idiosyncrasies and the local sensibilities mean that we need to, and we are figuring out networks of individuals in those markets who can help us directly transcreate and not just translate, so that you actually reach the audiences in the same way that we can engage them.
It's so funny. I actually had like two different conversations, one with a Spanish language only and one with a Canadian network. And I really asked them the question, what is the hardest nut to crack? Is it the infrastructure? Is it translation issues with the copy? And they said it is getting the client on board, because there's already the tools there to make this work. And to your point about idiosyncrasies with cultural differences, I talked about that a lot with Canada Land. And what they told me is that sometimes it's just about figuring out the market. Canada is such an interesting one because it is English language, but there's also a huge subset of French speakers. And there's a lot of different local customs and slang and vernacular that's very specific to Canada. And if you have a slip up in the copy, there could be like an issue with how that personal endorsement comes across or how that brand spot comes across that we can't even really understand as US people. And Stephen. So
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on. And I've even had clients turn around, as you can probably tell for those listeners that haven't seen me before. I'm not from around these parts, and I'm not just putting this accent on to sound clever. But the point is that, I've even had some of our clients come up to us and say, Steve, can you just translate that? And it's a categoric no, because I haven't lived in the UK for 12 years. I still follow the news there.
exactly.
I do not have my finger on the pulse of what is actually going to resonate with certain audiences. And as a consequence, when we have to translate it, I want to have somebody who's boots on the ground, who's going to be able to really do justice, because of the nature of podcast being, for me, the single most powerful medium for actually engaging with an individual beyond word of mouth. Because of the choice and because of the lean-in nature of the platform, you have to be spot on, because if you get it wrong, you don't get a second chance.
For some reason, I keep thinking, like, as a parallel, what if you're like an older person writing copy for a Gen Z audience? You wouldn't want to like go in and then try to use a bunch of slang terms that don't make any sense and make you look like an idiot. Why would you go into a foreign market and try to speak to that audience without doing due diligence?
People do both of those things all the time.
They do, and it's super cringy.
I have a living, breathing example of that every day with my 16-year-old son. When I tried to sound, hip and say things to him, he just looks at me, and then if we were on Zoom, would just leave the room.
Instead, it's over text, and he's like, this person has left the chat. Well, but to the brand safety conversation earlier, you end up coming across as disingenuous and doing more harm than good, and you're never going to make real headway there. Instead, you're going to have a bunch of consumers who are boycotting what you're doing because you're not investing in them in the right way, and you're asking them to invest in you. So
I think it's with everything, right? If you pretend, you're going to get found out.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So as we wrap up, I guess let's zoom out to what's sort of the economic impact. I know we've had some huge inventory shifts, different buying trends, like deal making has changed. Like, Dan, could you dive in and speak to any of these points or other points that you really see happening as sort of the impact that podcast is having on the industry and in the world more globally?
Well, so in terms of the economics of what's going on behind the scenes, it's interesting. So I left later in the afternoon on Thursday, and nobody that I spoke to had said a word about Silicon Valley Bank at that time. And
we knew by Wednesday that it was potentially coming.
It was not something people were talking about, but I think that what's interesting about that situation as it relates here is that there is a lot of venture money And there was a lot of irrational money powering this industry. And you're seeing waves of layoffs after layoffs after layoffs in media, including channels in the podcast industry. And so it was sort of an elephant in the room. What I did see was further validation that you have hungry sellers that are ready to make deals that they weren't necessarily needing to fight as hard for in the past. I'm seeing a lot more interest in accommodating buyers and finding a way to make things work. Whereas in a seller's market, it's kind of like, hey, this is what we got. You want to get in? We're doing you a favor, and we try to wedge our way in through a little bit of charm and relationship and buying power, but they're only going to go so far because there's so much demand on what's there. Now you have so much product. I mean, it is like the world had so much time and so much interest, and everybody and their mother started a podcast. And now you have all this product there and not enough audience to rationalize what I think people projected the industry could sustain. Doesn't mean the industry did anything wrong. It just means that there's only so much there's only so much revenue that the business is prepared to support, no matter how many great shows you have. That was one thing. But then additionally, you don't have the same money flying around, because what just happened? Companies that were not focused on profitability are suddenly focused on profitability. And why are they withdrawing all of this money out of Silicon Valley Bank? Because they need to hold on to their cash. When they need to hold on to their cash, they're going to test less shows. They're going to test shows with lower CPMs. So the consequences, I think you're seeing a lot more rational pricing and ability to price. And I think from where we sit, this is a very positive thing. I also am seeing that brands continue to move into the space. But what we know as a specialist organization is that a lot of the brands that come in through the larger agency players, they're getting killed in terms of their value, because they don't necessarily recognize the difference between a show that has a rabid audience who's a total, they're totally evangelical for the project, for the content and for the talent. And when that talent recommends a product to them, everybody buys it, and they only have 2 or 3 ads in an hour. Contrast that with the Madison Avenue brand that comes in and is one of 8 ads in an hour. They're the 3rd spot in a break. They have no frequency caps. And so every listener is having a negative impression because there are a lot of loose ends that aren't being managed, and it's read by a producer. Now, what was happening previously is that people weren't even aware. When we talk about the unknown unknowns, brands didn't even know how bad a deal they were getting. They're starting to become aware of it. But while that's happening, programmatic, everybody accepts that it's going to be a huge part of the business. It's not going to be the only part of the business, but that's going to be, if not most, it's going to be a lot. And I think people are getting ready for that. But what's interesting when people talk about it is you can't tell if they're talking about where it is today and what's possible versus where it's going to be in 2 or 3 years and what's possible, because today it's not that robust. It's not that good. But because of the pricing rationality that's coming into the market, instead of having, the challenge was they were pricing the produced ads that you could buy programmatically very closely to how they were producing or pricing the host read ads. And we know that there can be a 5 to 10x difference in value. That was not being recognized in the pricing. We're getting closer to a spread that makes sense. So you could actually buy a lot of the programmatic that's becoming available, but that wasn't possible before. That's new. So I think you're seeing a lot of pressure on the sales side. You're seeing a lot of pressure on creators. And the sad truth is that a lot of them are going to find something else to do with their time soon. And if you're on the buying side, you're now holding a lot more influence and sway than you were before. And it's a great opportunity for the brands who are not so VC dependent and have a business that's poised to scale. They're going to be able to hit the gas really hard. I think we're going to see some real powerful companies. When you think about BetterHelp or Indeed or Shopify, you see a lot of these brands. You're going to see other brands you had never heard of operating at those levels because they can now take advantage of the pricing that's available.
Well, and in addition, I know we've seen some sort of timeline shifts in buying trends, like having to book out super early or having different deals available more at the last minute, which we haven't seen historically. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, look, the airplane's going to take off with empty seats, and their job is to make sure that they sell the tickets so that there's something in every seat. And I think there's a lot of rapid experimentation, whether they're carving some out and giving it to a programmatic platform or just, working with an agency like ours to try to unload a lot of the excess inventory that they have. It's now, there's more inventory than ever. There's less demand than there's been in a while. And so it's an enormous, I can't understate the opportunity that exists for the people that are in a position to leverage it.
I agree 100%. I would like to just add specifically on the area of programmatic, which I know again is going to be a subject that we will investigate and interrogate in more depth on a specific session such as this. But it's going to depend on the client size and dimension. Big brands that wish to step in and play within the podcast world because they're jumping on the bandwagon may more inclined to use a trade desk and use it programmatically because they just see it as an extension of their digital campaign, right? Not knowing that they're probably paying hidden pricing for data, for upcharges based on whichever platform they're using. In the instance of the kind of clients that often we use, they are maybe using a quota of their dollars on programmatic, but they still want the nuance of being able to plan, show by show to be able to get the right quality sort of placement and understanding with the hosts. And I think there's a lane for both, right? There's going to be a lane for both. There's still lots to see how it shakes out. But to Dan's point, in terms of the economic factors that are impacting such decisions, I couldn't agree more.
Well, incredible insight. Thank you so much, one, for attending, and two, for bringing your perspectives here and sharing it with our audience. As always, this show is dedicated to our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We want you to not just know what is in the news, but know how to use it for good. If you're a marketer looking to balance your business objectives with your brand values, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Thank you to our guests and to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, the team at Podcast Movement for hosting their conference, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.